Hey checkers, today is April 13th, and this week we're dedicating the entire show to an interview that Adam and Darren did with Paul Shapiro. We hope you enjoy it, and we'll talk to you next week.
This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. I'm your host, Darren McKee, and with me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
And special guest Paul Shapiro, who is a lifetime animal welfare advocate and author of the recent Washington Post best-selling book, Clean Meat: How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Adam. Great to be with you.
Thanks for being here. As usual, I like to start with definitions so we're all on the same page and our listeners understand what we're talking about. You wrote a book called Clean Meat. So what is clean meat?
Clean meat is real meat that comes, instead of from animal slaughter, from animal cells. So imagine taking like a tiny sesame seed-sized biopsy of muscle from, let's just say, a cow. And inside of that muscle, there are millions of little satellite cells that their only career path in life is to become muscle. And that's the type of muscle that we eat when we eat meat. It's called skeletal muscle. And those cells, if you put them inside of a cultivator that makes them think they're still in the animal's body, so same body temperature, same feed and so on, then they do what they do best, which is grow into muscle. So we now have the capacity to actually grow real meat outside of animals' bodies. It's not an alternative to meat. It's not a substitute to meat. It is actual meat just divorced from raising and slaughtering animals.
Now you say actually meat, but I can see someone saying, well, is it actually meat because of the cellular structure of the end product that's involved? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's the same cells. It's the same cells. It would be like saying, we used to get all of our ice from ice that was formed in nature, with big ice industry where they would harvest blocks of ice from northern lakes, like in Ottawa, where you guys are, and transport it all over the world where they didn't have ice. Well, enter the advent of industrial refrigeration, and all of a sudden you had a much more efficient way to produce ice just by cooling the water right in front of you down. And the end result, though, is just ice. They're the same product. They're just ice. One is produced in nature, and the other is produced by technology. The benefits, though, of in the case of ice, are that you can have much cleaner ice because you can filter or boil the water prior to freezing it, whereas in natural ice, you have to just take whatever is in the waterway. The same so with clean meat. You can have much cleaner meat when you are growing it outside of the animal's body, because right now we are warned to treat raw meat in our kitchens kind of like toxic waste because it's riddled with feces. I mean, think about it, like Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli. These are intestinal pathogens that can kill us if we don't cook the crap out of our meat, literally. Literally have to cook the crap out of it.
I think that's a slogan for one of the fast food chains.
But with clean meat, you don't have to worry about that because you're not growing intestines at all. So you don't need to worry about intestinal pathogens. You're more likely to infect the meat perhaps from your own hands than you are from the meat itself. So there's real food safety benefits to growing clean meat, and there's huge environmental benefits and, of course, animal welfare benefits too.
Now, when I'd heard the phrase clean meat, I'd inadvertently assumed the clean related to the moral sense, but it sounds like what you're saying is the emphasis on the clean here is about the cleanliness of the facilities and of the product one might be consuming.
Yeah, so there's really two things. One is it's like clean energy. It's just much cleaner for the planet. So in the same way that, wind and solar and geothermal are considered clean energy because they're much cleaner to get than fossil fuels, growing meat without animals is much cleaner for the planet than factory farming and slaughterhouses because you have to use so many fewer resources. So, for example, one study published by Oxford found that growing clean beef compared to conventional beef would use 99% less land, 96% fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and more than 90% less water to produce the same amount of beef. Now, admittedly, it's still early in the game for these life cycle analyses because we don't really know exactly what it'll take to get these products to commercialization. But it's called clean meat because it's like clean energy and because it is just literally cleaner, as you just suggested, Darren.
That is a question I was going to follow up with you on about the environmental cost of such a thing. And I guess it's good to have a sense of what the environmental cost of the entire meat industry is, although it would probably depend on a particular animal involved and how much infrastructure was already set up. I would imagine if you're raising one cow instead of, say, 10,000, there's a different economy of scale if you're bringing something to market. And with clean meat, if it's decades in the making, perhaps it was far more resource intensive at the beginning, and as things come to fruition and there's more developments and more people involved, it will lower the price overall.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is something that has not only been in science fiction plots for decades, but even Winston Churchill talked about it. So in 1931, before he became prime minister, Churchill wrote this essay called 50 Years Hence, in which he was basically predicting what the world would look like in 50 years' time by the 1980s. And, sure, he was a few decades off, but he basically prophesized that we would escape the absurdity of raising whole animals when you could just grow the parts that you actually wanted to. And so you need far fewer resources to just produce, let's say, the chicken's breast than the entire chicken, which has the beak and the skeleton and the intestines and all the other things that you need energy for to keep the animal growing and alive. And so it does seem like it can be more resource efficient for that really self-explanatory reason, but it will require it to be brought to scale. Right now, for example, the first clean hamburger ever produced and eaten, which was in 2013, it cost about $330,000 to produce. It was
wow.
And then the fries were an extra $100,000.
Yeah, right. The fries were a real bargain. It was funded by Google co-founder Sergey Brin, and though now, just about 4 or 5 years later, that same burger is already dropped in price by over 80%. And in fact, a company in the United States, Memphis Meats, which is one of the leaders in the clean meat field, is producing meatballs for around $1,000 a pop. So comparative bargain when you look at that initial hamburger. So I don't know if it's like a Moore's Law effect, but it does seem like the price is coming way down. And it could be at cost competitive levels at some point with enough R&D applied to it.
Now, you mentioned that most of these clean meat substitutes are the ground beef variety, or so it seems. I wondered if there were other options for different types of meats, whether it's poultry or something else that people might seek the flavor of.
Yeah, great question. So I personally now, in the research of writing this book, Clean Meat, I ate clean beef, duck, fish, yogurt, even foie gras. So these companies are making all types of animal products without animals. It's not just beef. They're also making leather, milk, egg whites, gelatin. Some companies are even making spider silk without spiders. So, the application of biotechnology to food is offering us a great new range of options that can help address many of our most pressing sustainability problems, because these are such greener technologies than the way that it has been done in the past.
Interesting. When I think about clean from the reduced animal suffering point of view, it seems like that's exactly what will happen if more people try this. Mm-hmm. But if we imagine this theoretical diehard vegan who is concerned that at root this is an animal product, or at least it came from animal cells, what do you say to that individual?
Well, clean meat isn't intended for vegans. It's not a plant-based meat. It's the actual animal meat. So I think that for vegans who are simply concerned about animal cruelty, this does seem to satiate that concern. But I think many vegans probably won't want to eat it because it is actual meat. And so what the surveys suggest is that the more meat you eat right now, the greater interest you have in eating clean meat. The less meat you have right now, the less interest you have. So vegetarians, vegans, and even meat reducers generally have less interest in eating something like this. It's probably more intended to compete not with products like Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods or Tofurkey, but rather it's probably more intended to compete like with the Tyson Foods supplying chicken for KFC. In fact, interestingly enough, just yesterday rather, Tyson Foods announced that it has invested in Memphis Meats, that company that I mentioned. So here you have the largest meat producer in the United States investing in a clean meat startup, making it clear that it sees what the writing on the wall is, that it needs to diversify its protein sources, and that in the future, people aren't going to think protein means meat from animals. They might think of meat from cell culture, or they might think of even meat like plant-based meats that are made from peas or soy or other types of foods that can be made to look and taste like meat.
I think that's a good idea. And we recently did a show about the rates of vegetarianism and veganism. And if you're trying to capture the broadest market, you're going to have to appeal to more people than just those groups, because those groups are probably 1 or 5% at most.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, getting vegans to, let's say, switch from eating bean and rice burritos to eating clean meat isn't really that big of a win for the planet or animals. The goal is to displace factory farmed meat. That this is not something where the purveyors of clean meat are trying to win over, the farmers market crowd. They're really trying to win over like the fast food crowd.
Right. And relatedly, clean meat seems to be a technological and market-oriented solution to this problem of animal suffering. Why do you think this approach is necessary, or is it even necessary? Or maybe it isn't necessary, but it does seem to be one of the most prominent solutions people are putting forward.
Yeah, I'm in favor of a lot of approaches, because I think the problem of factory farming is so severe. It's so bad that you want lots of options. So in the same way that you want lots of different alternative energies like wind, solar, or geothermal, you want lots of alternatives to factory farming. Clean meat is one such alternative. Plant-based meats are another. Whole foods plant-based diets are another, where people, for example, would eat rice and beans. And so is meat reduction, things like meatless Mondays and other types of ways. But the problem of factory farming, from a climate change perspective, from a land, water, and soil pollution perspective, and land use perspective, and an animal cruelty perspective, is so bad that you really want multiple options. And here's why science and technology can be so helpful on this. So think about the whaling industry. We used to have a massive whaling industry to light our homes with whale oil. And there were a lot of concerns in the mid-19th century that we were going to cause whales to go extinct, or at least certain species of them that we were whaling, because they were just ruthless in their efficiency in killing these whales. And it wasn't those sustainability concerns that led to the demise of the whaling industry. It was the invention of kerosene for the most part. And the fact that you had kerosene, a cheaper, superior lighting source for our homes, that rendered the whaling industry obsolete, is similar to what might happen with clean meat, in that it won't be people switching for moral or ethical reasons, as compelling as those reasons are. It will be people switching because it's the more convenient or maybe more affordable option.
Let's hope so. I was thinking about advantages and disadvantages, and I was wondering if you could speak to that in the broad sense. Or more specifically, what do you think is the biggest hurdle clean meat will have to overcome?
I think there are 3 hurdles that the clean meat field has. So, it's no longer science fiction. It is now science fact. I mean, we're already producing these products. I've eaten them many times. You have about a dozen startups all racing to commercialize. But the 3 biggest hurdles are, 1, just getting the technology right so you can actually bring this to scale. It's just too expensive right now. These are technologies that are largely from the medical space and now being applied to food. People are willing to pay for medicines a lot of money. People aren't willing to pay a lot of money for food. So you've got to get a way to make these foods at much cheaper costs. So that's 1. The second is government regulation. Will these products be allowed to be sold? In which countries will they be allowed to be sold? And what can they be called? We have standards of identity, for example, that say, like, if you want to sell, for example, mayonnaise, the FDA's standard of identity says that you need to have eggs in there. Well, what about if you're making mayonnaise that doesn't have eggs and it tastes the same and looks the same? Can you call it that? And the answer is no. So what about standard identities for products like chicken or beef? Will you be allowed to call these chicken or beef? I mean, they are. That's exactly what they are. They are the same cells that are in the chicken or beef that people buy now. But what will they have to be called? That's one thing. So that's the second thing, rather. And then the third is just consumer acceptance. I think that a lot of people are willing to at least give these foods a try. Surveys suggest that about a third of Americans are willing to regularly eat this. But, novel foods, or at least foods that are perceived as novel, can take some getting used to. And so we need to make sure that we think about clean meats, 1, with a cool, rational head about us to look at what the facts are, and not just go with a gut reaction, but also think about the benefits they bring from a sustainability perspective, from a climate change perspective, and recognize that they are the same. They are not any different. In the same way that ice from your freezer is not that different from ice from a lake, except perhaps safer, they are the same.
I think it is interesting that many people say they don't like philosophy, but issues of essentialism seem to creep in here and there. Regarding the mayo, did you mean the Hampton Creek example?
Yeah, so Hampton Creek, which has now changed their name, they're now called Just, and that's the actual name. So I'm not saying they're just, that is the name.
That's marketing right there.
Yes. So the company Hampton Creek, which is now called Just, it's kind of like Prince. The company formerly known as Hampton Creek, they got in trouble with the FDA over the name of their product, Just Mayo. And there's no standard of identity for mayo, but there is for mayonnaise. And so the question was, is mayo mayonnaise basically? And they were able to settle with the FDA to essentially make it clearer on the package that it is the name is Just Mayo, but that it is egg free. And so, the purpose for a standard of identity though is to prevent consumer fraud. Like you don't want to, like there's a standard of identity, for example, on certain things to make sure things can't get watered down too much, or, you're calling one thing something when it's actually something else. But nobody is being defrauded when somebody buys mayo and it doesn't have eggs in it. Nobody's thinking, oh, I really thought this had eggs in it. It's the same issue with milk. Right now, the cow's milk producers are very upset about products like soy milk and rice milk and almond milk and coconut milk. And they are trying to prevent these plant-based milk purveyors from calling their products milk. But nobody who buys soy milk thinks they're buying cow's milk. It's not like they're being frauded into thinking it. So that's the issue, on standards of identity. I think it's going to be a big one for the clean meat industry.
Well, this particular issue is somewhat relevant to Canada, because we sort of have different regulations regarding what is called soy milk in other countries, but you'll find that here in Canada, and it'll be more referred to as some sort of soy drink. They can't actually use the milk, and that sort of has to do with actual dairy lobbyists who won't allow them to use it. So I guess that kind of thing is generally going to vary by country, depending on legislation there, depending on lobbying there, and a lot of different factors.
It looks like milk, and it's called silk, which has similar letters to milk, but it's not milk.
Yeah.
Interestingly, like on let's say like plant-based chickens in the United States, they always say something like chicken with like with apostrophe N, or maybe with a Y in the chick, or they'll say like they always try to find like some clever way just not to say chicken. One of them has a good one. They just say chicken-free chicken strips. That actually seems
yeah, if someone showed me chicken with no I and there was a Y instead and no E at the end, I would think that's a Silicon Valley-based company. Since you mentioned plant-based dairy products, and they've been pretty successful, at least compared to the meat substitutes, I wondered why that might be. Why do you think there's that main difference between those two different markets? And secondly, I wondered if there's anything paralleling clean meat like clean dairy.
Yes. So let's go in order. So on the first question, at least in the United States, plant-based milks are now at over 10% of the fluid dairy market, whereas plant-based meats are well under 1% of the meat market. So a huge disparity in terms of popularity. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that plant-based milks are now they're marketed in the same place as cow's milk, in the same types of cartons as cow's milk. And so there's no difference. You just go to that aisle. There's a lot of health concerns that lead people to choose plant-based milks. And it's functionally very similar to cow's milk. And it's cost competitive with it. The three factors that lead most people to make their food decisions are price, taste, and convenience. And the plant-based milk purveyors have really are competing on all three of those, on price, taste, and convenience, and they're competing well. So when you look, though, at plant-based meats, it's extremely rare that they are marketed alongside of animal meats. They're usually relegated to like the frozen natural food section of the mainstream supermarket. Most protein consumers are not going to the frozen section, and they're certainly not going to the natural food section. So the key is to get it in the meat aisle, packaged like meat, and cost competitive with meat. There is one company, Beyond Meat, that is a great company, has a great product called the Beyond Burger, and they are now in over 5,000 stores. But what they have done is they've gotten the grocers to put them in the meat aisle. So when you go to look for ground beef, you'll see their patties. Now, they're not yet cost competitive, but they're not that bad. I mean, they're still only about $2.99 per patty. It's a very substantial patty. So it's not cost competitive with ground beef yet, but it is, it is actually well placed, tastes great, and is, I think, reasonably priced.
Yeah, I guess people are willing to pay a premium, but not a huge premium. Maybe they'll be willing to spend 10, maybe 15% more. But if the cost is, triple or 10 times or 50 times more, I'm not sure there's that much of a market for it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And I think about myself in this. I, of course, like most people, consider myself an ethical person. And I try to factor ethics into my consumer choices. Yet I know if I am at Target and they have like a $7 t-shirt, I'm thinking, wow, that's really great. And I'm probably not thinking, I wonder what the life was like for the people who made it. That's really a hard thing for us to do, to act as ethically as we want to in our consumer choices. Generally, we act more ethically as citizens than we do as consumers. Like, you would probably vote for a law that banned the sale of sweatshop produced goods, but we still purchase sweatshops produced goods yourself.
Yeah, I guess sometimes we need laws and regulations to have us become better versions of ourselves. In your research for the book Clean Meat, I wondered, in talking to those people, even for yourself, how would you and they answer the question, what success looks like? Like, what percentage of the market are they trying to realistically get a hold of? Will they have any goals by the year? I'm sure with investors, they have certain targets that they're trying to reach.
Well, they do have investors. None of them are public yet, so they don't have shareholders, but they do have investors. So take Memphis Meats as an example. They have now been invested in by everybody from Tyson Foods to Cargill to Richard Branson and Bill Gates. So they certainly, they want to maximize the returns for their investors. But these folks are ethically minded. The CEO of Memphis Meats is a doctor named Uma Valetti. And Dr. Valetti is trying to solve the problem of factory farming. What Memphis Meats is trying to do is essentially render factory farms as obsolete as horse-drawn carriages. We, in the same way, like with whale oil, how it was displaced by a technological innovation of kerosene. Now you have, this other example where we had horses for millennia who were our transporters. And despite serious animal welfare concerns for the horses, what ended up liberating horses from labor in our streets was the invention of the internal combustion engine. So that's what Dr. Valetti and Memphis Meats are trying to do, is to basically displace the factory farming of animals with a cleaner, more sustainable, more humane alternative.
I was thinking about how many people complain about the taste of artificial meat or voice those concerns, but I was thinking how people actually eat meat. And with something like ground beef, people almost always are using spices or sauces, and if they have a hamburger, they're adding, 5 or 10 ingredients, so they actually enjoy the taste of it. So do you think it's kind of amusing that some people are complaining about the taste of artificial meat when they actually don't like the taste of real meat in the first place?
Yeah, humans have been eating meat since the dawn of humanity. Since Homo sapiens have existed, it appears that we have been eating meat. So, and when developing countries start expanding their middle class, one of the first things that people do is start eating more meat. So there does seem to be something in a lot of people that makes them just want to eat meat. But yeah, I've noticed the same thing that you're saying. For most people, the idea of eating raw meat is pretty repulsive. And the idea of needing to season it and make it taste more palatable, it does beg the question of, why are we doing this? But the facts speak pretty loudly that, we're eating more meat on a per capita basis now than pretty much ever before in America. And around the world, rates of meat consumption are only growing. So if we want to be able to satiate this astronomical demand for meat that there is, we need to find much more efficient and much more humane ways of doing it. And this is one such way. I, for one, would be quite pleased if people would choose to not eat meat. Or to eat even less meat would be a big advancement. But right now, the trends are going in the opposite direction. And so the question is, can we find ways to have our meat and eat it too? And I think with clean meat, that is one way to do it. Not the only way, but one way.
You raised some important concerns I was having. It seems like the trend lines are going in the right direction in some ways, where people are caring more about animals, but in the other way, more and more people are eating meat pretty much everywhere. It's great that more people are escaping extreme poverty, but these people end up eating more meat. So the devil's advocate stance might be, so let's say clean meat does kind of work. What's the best outcome here? 5 to 10% of the market in 20 to 50 years? Does that really matter? All these resources going into something that may not in the end be impactful enough.
Well, there's not a lot of resources going into it yet, sadly. I mean, you're talking like of the entire clean meat industry combined, only a few tens of millions of dollars. And so,
well, it's okay to have a faulty premise. I think it's good that you point that out.
yeah. So, I mean, it's not a lot of resources. Frankly, I wish it were more. But I do suspect that it will be more than 5% within decades. I do think that the necessity to do this is so great, considering the challenges that we face environmentally speaking, that I think you're going to probably have government intervention to help at some point. Maybe not the U.S. government, but perhaps elsewhere, in order to help get this industry off the ground.
For comparison, if you happen to know the numbers, I imagine there's something like tens of millions going into clean meat. Is that true? And I wondered how that compares to the traditional so-called meat market, which I assume is hundreds of billions, is it maybe even $1 trillion?
Yeah, probably. It's certainly hundreds of billions just in the U.S. alone. So the value of the global meat industry, I mean, my guess, this is just a guess, but I'm sure, especially when you include the seafood industry, you're talking trillions of dollars, yeah.
Since we met at an effective altruism conference, a question in my mind, and perhaps for any effective altruists or others listening, is what is the value of more people supporting the cause of clean meat compared to others?
There are a lot of ways that we can help improve the world, and by that I mean reduce suffering and increase happiness. And as somebody who cares a lot about doing both of those things, the reason I wrote this book is because I believe that the cellular agriculture movement has the potential to reduce a vast amount of suffering. So just put it this way. Let's just take in North America alone. Not even North America, just Canada and the United States. There are more farm animals who are raised and slaughtered for food every single year than there are human beings on the planet. And most of those animals have lives that are really deplorable. They're lives that you probably don't even want to hear about. I mean, you think about just chickens, and I'm not going to scare anybody off, but so I'll keep this pretty tame. But most of the chickens who we raise for food have been genetically selected to grow extremely big, extremely fast, so they have difficulty even taking more than a few steps before they collapse underneath their bulk. They are overcrowded inside of factory farms. So they live in their own feces. They're often living wing to wing, pumped full of antibiotics. And when it comes time for the slaughter, most people don't even want to hear about it. So when you consider that there are billions and billions of animals enduring lives as wretched as that, preventing the that type of suffering, that type of cruelty is a huge gain for anybody who's concerned about reducing the misery on the planet. Now, of course, you have to accept that animal suffering matters. That's a premise that I accept, and I think a lot of people do. But if you don't think animal suffering matters, then that's a philosophy I don't subscribe to. But then you would probably want to focus elsewhere. But if you do think that the suffering of other species matters, and you think that has some moral import, then the suffering of farm animals is so vast, it's so intense, and there's so many of them that we have to get serious about it. And one of the best ways that we have to try to combat that suffering seems to be through food technology, whether through plant-based or clean meats or both.
I think that makes sense, and I tend to agree in general. And, people still love their cats and dogs despite eating animals, an interesting quirk about humanity. So imagine someone's listening and they feel this is amazing, clean meat is a great idea. What can that individual do if they think this is a good idea and they want to promote it and they want to help it succeed?
Well, right now, your only real option, if you want to actually financially invest, you have to have probably six figures of dollars to invest. And you can do that through, like, for example, Clear Current Capital is one fund that will take your money and invest it for you in these types of startups. But let's say you don't have $100,000 or $200,000 to invest, and instead you just want to be able to be supportive. I would suggest talking about this both in your social media and in your personal life. Obviously, you want to get the book Clean Meat and read it and buy it for all your friends. Needless to say, and of course, leave good Amazon reviews. But seriously, one of the hurdles that the clean meat industry faces, as I mentioned, is going to be consumer acceptance. And so each one of us can start working on that now, because these products are likely to be commercialized within years, not decades. And So we can start that process now of helping to increase consumer acceptance by extolling the numerous benefits of cellular agriculture.
Thanks, Paul. If people want to buy your book or learn more about you, where should they go?
So kind of you, Darren, cleanmeat.com. So if you go to cleanmeat.com, you can learn more about the book. You can see everywhere where you can buy the book, and also how to contact me. So I would welcome hearing from anybody, especially after you've read the book. I'd love to get your thoughts.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Adam and Darren. Thanks so much for your time.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.